Deep in the hills of West Virginia, along a stretch of road that locals have quietly feared for decades, stands a house that should be dark. It has no electricity, no residents, no signs of life. And yet, night after night, drivers passing Route 9 report seeing lights flickering in the second-floor windows, sometimes steady, sometimes dancing like candlelight in a storm. And sometimes, just sometimes, a figure standing behind the glass, perfectly still, watching the road below. When the cars slow down, the lights go out. When investigators finally entered the property, they found no power source, no trespassers, no explanation. Just silence, dust, and a single haunting detail left behind on the wooden floor near the entrance, wet footprints, leading inward. None leading back out. This is not a story that was invented around a campfire. These are real reports from real drivers spanning real years. And tonight, we are going to walk through every detail because some mysteries do not ask to be solved, they ask to be respected. Stay with me. Because by the end of this story, you may never look at a dark house the same way again. Before we begin, I have one question for you. Where in the world are you watching this right now? Are you tucked into bed with your phone screen dimmed low? Are you driving? Please, please, pull over first along some quiet road of your own. Are you sitting in a room where if you looked up right now, you might notice a window you forgot to check? Drop it in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your time zone. Tell me if it is raining where you are, or if the street outside is unusually quiet tonight. Tell me if you are brave enough to be watching this alone, or if you made someone sit with you because deep down you already knew this one was going to be different. I read every single comment. Every one. And I want to know exactly where in the world my people are tonight, because stories like this one feel different depending on where you are sitting when you hear them. So go ahead, drop your location below, and let us see just how far this reaches. Now, let us begin. The abandoned house on Route 9. To understand what has been happening along Route 9 in West Virginia, you first have to understand the landscape itself, because West Virginia is not like other places. It is a state of deep hollows and ridge lines, of rivers that cut through rock like something ancient and determined. The roads there do not follow logic the way roads do in flatter parts of the country. They follow the shape of the land, winding around hills and through valleys, disappearing into tree lines and reappearing somewhere unexpected. At night, especially in the rural stretches, those roads become something else entirely. The darkness is not just the absence of light, it is a presence, a thickness, a kind of silence that city people have never truly encountered, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat if you are still enough. Route 9 runs through that kind of silence. It is a two-lane road that passes through communities with deep roots and longer memories. People who live along Route 9 have stories. They always have. Stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren, stories that were whispered and not written down, stories that outlived the people who first told them. And, nestled somewhere along that quiet road between overgrown fields and stands of old oak and hickory, is a house that has become the center of one of those stories. A two-story house. White paint, once. Now gray and peeling, curling away from the wood beneath like old skin. A covered porch that lifts slightly to one side, the boards swollen and cracked from decades of West Virginia winters. Shutters that were once probably quite beautiful, now hanging at wrong angles, missing slats, half attached to their frames. A yard that nature has reclaimed entirely, tall grass and briars, and the kind of creeping vines that slowly consume things, working their way into gaps and cracks, pulling the structure back toward the earth one season at a time. The house has been empty for years. A long time. Long enough that the people who remember the last family to live there are themselves getting old. Long enough that the details of that family's departure have blurred into the general fog of local memory. Some people say the family simply moved away for work. Some say there was a tragedy. Some say the house was sold and resold and eventually stopped being sold at all because nobody stayed long enough to want it. The truth of why the house became abandoned matters less than the truth of what it became after. Because here is the thing about that house. It should be completely dark at night. There is no electrical service. The utility company has confirmed this. The line was disconnected many years ago and no application for reconnection has ever been filed. There are no solar panels on the roof. You can see that clearly from the road. There is no generator, no evidence of one ever having been brought inside. The house has no functional source of power. Not one that any utility company, any electrician, or any investigating officer has ever been able to identify. And yet, the lights turn on. The first documented report that researchers have been able to trace with any confidence came from a long-haul truck driver who was passing through the area sometime in the early 2000s. He was driving late, well past midnight, and he noticed what he described as a warm glow coming from the second-floor windows of the house as he approached it from the south. He thought, at first, that someone must have moved in, that the abandoned property had been purchased, that renovation was underway, that someone was simply burning a lamp while working late. He slowed down slightly as he passed, curious. And as he did, the light went out. Instantly. As if someone had flipped a switch the moment they saw his headlights slowing, he mentioned it to someone at the next truck stop. They told him they had heard something similar from another driver the year before. He did not think much more about it. But the reports continued. Through the 2000s and into the 10s and beyond, drivers along Route 9 have logged consistent accounts of the same phenomenon, a glow appearing in the second-floor windows of the abandoned house. Sometimes described as steady, like a lamp burning in a closed room, sometimes described as flickering, like candlelight, or like something moving between the light and the window. The glow is never bright. It is never harsh or white like a flashlight or a phone screen. Witnesses consistently describe it as warm, amber, dim, the kind of light that belongs to an older era. Kerosene lanterns, firelight. Something slow and orange and patient. The consistency of these descriptions is, to those who study such things, one of the most compelling aspects of the entire phenomenon. When people fabricate paranormal experiences, their accounts tend to vary wildly because imagination is personal and different imaginations produce different details. But these accounts do not vary much. They converge. Drivers who have never spoken to each other, who found out only after the fact that others had seen the same thing, describe the same amber glow, the same second floor, the same quality of light that seems somehow too settled, too calm, too purposeful to belong to an empty building. And then there is the other detail, the figure. Not every witness reports it. Perhaps 1 in 3 or 4 who see the light also report seeing something in the window, a shape, a silhouette, something that appears to be standing just behind the glass and looking out. Those who report it do so with varying degrees of certainty. Some say they are not sure it was a figure, that it might have been a curtain or a shadow cast by the light itself, but others are quite certain. They describe the outline of what appears to be a person, standing still, watching the road below with a patience that, they say, is itself unsettling, more unsettling, in some ways, than the light, because the figure never moves, it does not gesture, it does not react. It simply stands there, watching, for as long as the witness is able to observe it. And then the car slows down, and the light goes out. There is a particular quality to that detail, the light extinguishing at the moment a vehicle decelerates that. Investigators and curious locals alike have found impossible to dismiss. Because if the light were the result of some natural phenomenon, some unusual reflection of passing headlights, some atmospheric optical effect, then it should not respond to the behavior of the observer. Natural phenomena do not notice when you slow down. Reflections do not decide to stop when curiosity approaches. But whatever is creating the light in that house, it seems, consistently to be aware. Several witnesses have tested this. One man, a former resident of a nearby community who had heard the stories for years and decided to investigate on his own, drove past the house multiple times on a single night. On his first pass, he maintained highway speed and saw the glow clearly in the upper windows as he approached and passed. On his second pass, he began slowing well before the house came into view, reducing his speed gradually so as not to appear to be stopping. The light was visible as he rounded the bend toward the property. But by the time he was adjacent to the house, it was gone. He wrote about this experience in detail on a regional online forum, noting that his deceleration had begun perhaps a quarter of a mile before the house, far enough away that he did not believe headlights or engine noise alone could have signaled his approach. He went back a third time that same night, keeping his speed steady. The light was there again. He never published any conclusion. He simply posted what he observed. And he noted at the end of his post that he would not be going back. Not because he was afraid of the light, he wrote, but because of the way it felt to know that whatever was inside had noticed him the 2 times he had slowed and chosen to hide. Local authorities in the area have responded to the house on multiple occasions over the years. The calls typically come from concerned drivers who either want someone to check on the property or who want to report what they believe may be trespassers. Officers who have responded to these calls have uniformly found the same thing: nothing, or rather almost nothing. The house is consistently found with no signs of forced entry. The doors are locked, the windows, where intact, are closed. There are no broken panes, no pried open frames, no evidence of anyone having pushed their way in or out. The interior, on each occasion that officers have entered, shows no signs of recent occupation. No sleeping areas, no food, no personal effects, no fire pits or burn marks from candles or lanterns. The electrical system, when examined, is confirmed to be completely non-functional wiring. Old, disconnected, in no condition to carry current, even if current were somehow available. The floor, in particular, is consistently described as deeply dusty, the kind of dust that accumulates over many years of undisturbed settling, the kind that records every footprint with perfect clarity. And officers entering the building naturally leave their own footprints behind, tracks that they can follow back to the entrance when they leave. But on at least one occasion, and this is the detail that has been quietly circulated among those who follow this case, officers found footprints that did not belong to them. Wet footprints on a floor otherwise covered in dry dust, a series of wet impressions leading from the entrance toward the interior of the house. Shoe-shaped, human-sized. Clear enough to count the steps. The officers counted them and followed them across the entry area toward the staircase. They stopped at the base of the stairs. There were no prints leading back. The investigators spent considerable time trying to explain this. Was there a leak somewhere above, dripping water onto the floor? They checked. There was no active leak visible, and the pattern of the wet prints was too deliberate, too stride-like to suggest dripping water. Was it condensation from the floor itself? Possible in theory, but the other areas of flooring showed no such moisture. Was it the officers themselves, carrying water in from outside on their boots? They checked their own boots. They had entered through dry conditions, and their own tracks, while visible in the dust, were dry. The wet footprints were photographed. They were documented in the report. And then the report was filed, and no official explanation was ever provided, because none was available. There is a woman who lives within a few miles of the house, I will call her Margaret, because she asked not to be identified by name, who has lived in the area her entire life. She is in her 70s now, soft-spoken and deliberate, not the kind of person who reaches for drama or embellishment. She agreed to speak about the house because, she said, she is tired of people treating it like entertainment. She wants it understood as something real. She remembers the house from when it was occupied. She was a child then, and the family who lived there were quiet people, private people, people who kept mostly to themselves and were known in the community primarily for the wife's garden, which was reportedly extraordinary flowers of every kind, a riot of color in summer that she remembers clearly even now. The family moved away when Margaret was perhaps 10 or 11 years old. She does not remember any drama surrounding their departure. They were simply there, and then they were not. The house sat empty for a while. Then, for a period, Margaret believes it was rented out, then empty again. Then, on the market, unsuccessfully. and eventually it settled into its current state of permanent, resigned vacancy. Margaret saw the light herself for the first time when she was in her late 30s. She was driving home from visiting a friend late on a winter evening, taking Route 9 because it was the most direct route. The night was clear and very cold, and she remembers the stars being unusually bright. She came around the bend toward the house and saw, in the second-floor window on the right side, a soft amber glow. She says it was beautiful. Actually, the word she uses is beautiful, not frightening. It looked, she says, like someone sitting by a lamp reading a book. Peaceful, settled. The kind of light that says someone is home. She slowed down because she was confused. She knew the house was supposed to be empty, and the light went out. She sat in her car on the side of the road for a long time. She did not get out. She did not call anyone. She eventually drove home and did not speak about it for years because, she says, she did not want people to think she was confused or making things up. She has seen it several more times since then. She does not believe it is paranormal, or rather, she is careful to say she does not know what she believes. What she does believe is that something is there, something that has been there for a long time, something that keeps its own schedule, follows its own rules, and has no interest in being explained or exposed. She respects it, she says. And she would appreciate it if others did too. There are, of course, rational frameworks that people have applied to this mystery. Let us walk through them because they deserve to be considered seriously. The most commonly proposed explanation is bioluminescence specifically, the kind produced by certain fungi that grow in decaying wood. Bioluminescent fungi do exist, and they do produce a faint greenish-gold glow that can be visible in complete darkness. Some varieties have historically been called foxfire or fairy fire, and they have been documented in old buildings and forested areas throughout the eastern United States. Could the glow in the windows of the Route 9 house be the result of such fungi? It is possible, in theory, that the right conditions exist inside the house, sufficient decay, sufficient moisture, the right species of fungus, but there are difficulties with this explanation. Bioluminescent fungi produce a consistent, non-responsive glow. They do not flicker, they do not extinguish when observed, they cannot create the impression of a figure standing at a window. And they certainly cannot produce the kind of warm amber light that witnesses consistently describe foxfire tends toward cold green-white tones. The description does not match. Another explanation sometimes proposed is that the light is the result of reflected moonlight or passing headlights bouncing off surfaces inside the house in an unusual way. Houses with dirty or aged glass can sometimes create unexpected optical effects. And Route 9 is not a heavily traveled road, so a vehicle passing at a certain angle with certain headlight configurations might theoretically create a visible reflection inside. But again, this explanation struggles with the consistency of the accounts, and it cannot explain why the effect disappears. At the moment a vehicle slows, changing headlight angle and intensity, yes, but in a way that should produce different effects, not a clean disappearance. There is also the possibility of deliberate human activity. People who have gained access to the property and are using it for purposes they wish to keep hidden. This would explain the responsiveness to observation. Someone inside would naturally extinguish their light if they heard a car slowing down outside. And it would explain the wet footprints if someone had crossed wet ground before entering the building. But this explanation has its own difficulties. The access question remains unresolved. Investigators have never found evidence of entry. The electrical question persists. No power source was ever found. And the sheer duration of the phenomenon, spanning more than 2 decades of consistent reports, makes sustained secret human occupancy an increasingly strained proposition. People who use abandoned buildings for illicit purposes tend not to maintain the same location for 20+ years without some evidence of their presence accumulating. None of the rational explanations fit cleanly. None of them account for all of the observed details simultaneously. This does not mean the explanation is supernatural. It means the explanation has not yet been found. And that distinction matters. What this case does well, what makes it genuinely compelling beyond its eerie surface, is the way it illustrates the relationship between the unknown and the human mind. We are creatures who need explanations. We are built neurologically to find patterns and assign causes. When something resists explanation, when it continues calmly and consistently to exist outside the categories we have prepared for it, something in us responds. Sometimes with fear, sometimes with fascination, sometimes with a quiet, complicated feeling that sits between reverence and unease and does not quite translate into words. The lights on Route 9 produce that feeling. And there is something worth honoring in that. Not every mystery needs to be solved. Some mysteries teach us more by remaining open, by reminding us that the world is larger than our current understanding of it, that the categories we use to sort experience are useful but imperfect, that there are things at the edges of the known world that are still waiting to be understood. The house stands, the lights appear, drivers pass, or slow, or sometimes stop, and whatever is inside notices and becomes dark and waits. Over the years, a small number of people have attempted more organized investigations of the Route 9 house. Some have used night vision cameras set up at a distance, recording the house for hours at a time. Some of these recordings capture nothing unusual. Others, a smaller number, but documented, show what appears to be a light source visible through the windows during the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning, appearing and disappearing over the course of the recorded period. These recordings have been analyzed by people with photography and video expertise, and no consensus explanation has been reached. Lens artifact does not fully account for what is visible. Reflection does not fully account for it either. One group of investigators, a small team of people with backgrounds in paranormal research, geology, and environmental science, spent 3 nights in vehicles parked at a distance from the house, monitoring it with various instruments. They recorded temperature fluctuations inside the building using external sensors, electromagnetic field readings using standard equipment, and audio using directional microphones. On the second night, they recorded a sequence of events that they have described in their published account as follows. At approximately 2:17 in the morning, the amber glow appeared in the right side second floor window. It persisted for approximately 11 minutes. During this period, their temperature sensors recorded a localized drop of several degrees inside the upper story of the house, inconsistent with the ambient outdoor temperature, which was stable during this period. Their electromagnetic sensors showed no unusual readings. Their directional audio, however, picked up something during those 11 minutes that they were not able to explain, a low, intermittent sound from within the house that they describe as rhythmic, roughly consistent with footsteps on wooden floorboards. Slow, patient, moving without urgency. At minute 11, the light went out. The temperature returned to baseline. The audio went silent. No vehicle had passed during those 11 minutes. Nothing had approached the house. Whatever caused the light to appear that night and whatever caused it to go out was operating on its own timeline. There is a rule, as mentioned, among those who know Route 9 well. Do not slow down. It is passed from driver to driver, from old to young, from parent to teenager who has just gotten their license and will be taking Route 9 home late from a friend's house for the first time. It is not always explained in detail. Sometimes it is just offered as simple instruction, the way you might tell someone new to the area about a road that floods or a curve that catches people off guard. Just something you need to know. Do not slow down. The reasoning, when it is spelled out, varies. Some people say it is simply practical that the shoulder of the road near the house is soft and unreliable, that stopping there in the dark is a safety issue. Some people frame it in more direct terms, that whatever is in that house has been watching the road for a very long time, and that drawing its attention to yourself, specifically, is not something you want to do. Some people do not explain it at all. They just say it with the quiet certainty of someone who has decided, after consideration, that some things in life are best left undisturbed. And most people, when they drive that road late at night and see that amber glow appear in the second floor windows, find that the rule makes sense to them very quickly and very naturally. They keep driving, they watch the glow in their mirrors until the trees close behind them and the road curves away, and they do not talk about it until they are somewhere brighter. The house remains today exactly as it has been for years. No new owners, no demolition, no renovation, no explanation. The local government has flagged it periodically as a potential code issue, but no action has ever been taken. It stands on its stretch of Route 9 with the patient stillness of something that has decided it is not going anywhere. The vines continue their slow work, the porch continues to list, the shutters hang at their wrong angles, moving slightly in the wind on days when the wind comes through the valley, and at night, when Route 9 gets quiet and the traffic drops away and the darkness settles fully into the hills, the lights come on, warm and amber and patient, on the second floor, behind the glass, sometimes steady, sometimes flickering, sometimes with a shape in the window that stands very still and watches the road below with a quality of attention that witnesses, without exception, find impossible to forget. And when a car slows, darkness, instant, total, chosen. As if whatever is in that house simply prefers not to be seen by those who are looking too closely. As if there is a difference understood by something with its own sense of intention between a driver who passes and one who stops. As if the house or whatever keeps its schedule inside the house has its own rules, its own preferences, its own ancient and unhurried relationship with the road outside. The investigators have come and gone. The cameras have recorded, the sensors have measured, the reports have accumulated. And the house has offered no resolution, no confession, no explanation. Only continuity. Only the amber glow, returning night after night to the second floor window of a building that has no power, no residents, no reason to be lit at all. Only the footprints, wet on a dry floor, leading inward, and stopping at the staircase, and going no further. And that is where we leave it tonight. Not with an answer, not with a resolution tied neatly and safely into something that makes the world feel smaller and more manageable. We leave it where it actually lives, in the open air, in the quiet dark along Route 9, in the second floor window of a house that has been keeping its own secrets for longer than most of us have been paying attention. I hope this story found you somewhere comfortable. I hope you are warm, and that whatever room you are in has enough light in it to feel settled. I hope that when you close your eyes tonight, what you find there is rest, the deep, unhurried kind that comes when the day is done and the questions can wait until morning. Because here is the thing about mysteries like this one. They are not going anywhere. The house will still be there tomorrow night and the night after that. The lights will still come on, the road will still be quiet, and somewhere in the hills of West Virginia, something with patience far exceeding our own will keep doing whatever it is it has always done, quietly, consistently, without any apparent need for our understanding or our permission. There is something almost peaceful in that, if you let yourself feel it. The world is full of things that are older than our curiosity about them, and they are fine. They have been fine for a long time. They will continue to be fine long after we have finished asking questions. So tonight, let the questions rest. Let Route 9 do what Route 9 does, and you rest too. Good night, wherever you are watching from. Sleep well. And if you found this story worth your time, leave a comment, share it with someone who loves a good mystery, and let me know, what do you think is in that house? I will see you in the next one.
In almost every corner of America, there's a road like this one, quiet in daylight, mean after dark. It's the stretch locals warn you about in a tone that sounds like a joke, until you realize they aren't really joking. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are, because timing matters on this one. If you're a fan of the strange, the dark, and the mysterious, you've come to the right place. Tonight, we're headed into the Blue Ridge foothills outside a small Virginia town called Lindell, the kind of place where the diner closes early on weeknights, where the hills fold into each other like knuckles, and one narrow, shoulderless blacktop snakes through the trees, as if the forest braided it by hand. On a map, it's labeled Ashfield Road. To people who live there, it's just the stretch. 10 miles from the highway to a gravel crossroad, no houses you can see from the lane, a canopy so tight that even the moon can't pry its way in. If you ask about it, most folks will shrug and say it's just a back way. Then they'll add, almost as an afterthought, don't drive it at night, especially not past mile 13. Mile 13 is where the trouble starts. Our story centers on a man named Evan Hale, 32. Volunteer firefighter, part-time mechanic. The kind of person who keeps a turnout bag behind his truck seat and jumper cables coiled like a habit. Evan's shift ran late, and by the time he packed up the station on a Friday, it was past 1 in the morning. Fog was already spilling into the low places. The radio in his truck picked up only 2 stations, church songs, and static, so he let the cab go quiet and headed for home the back way. He knew better than to take Ashfield Road after midnight. He'd said so himself. Plenty of times. To plenty of people. But the highway was closed for repaving, and his dog needed out, and Ashfield promised him 20 minutes saved. That's how it always starts. A little logic, a little hurry, and a story you don't believe yet. Ashfield eases you in. The first 3 miles are almost friendly soft curves, the faint smell of cut hay where a field leans toward the trees. Then the asphalt narrows. The guardrail gives up. The yellow line buckles and vanishes under a rash of tar snakes. Evan's headlights tunneled ahead, and everything outside that cone of light stopped existing. The forest on either side stood dense and damp, leaves sweating in the heat that lingers after midnight. His cell showed 1 bar, then none. The clock on the dash clicked from 1:47 to 1:48, then back to 1:47 again, as if the truck had sighed and changed its mind. He reached the first landmark, an iron truss bridge over a creek that locals still call the Run. The bridge is narrow, cold. If you roll your window down, you can hear the water walk over stone like someone shuffling cards. Teenagers come here to honk 3 times and wait for a reply. They say if you hear a 4th honk, it's not yours. They say if you honk back, you won't get out of the hollow before dawn. Evan didn't honk. He did what sensible people do, kept his hands steady on the wheel and eyes on the end of the truss, where the road slid back into the trees. That's when his odometer ticked. Not up-down. He watched the trip meter slide from 7.3 miles to 7.2. He blinked. The number held. He chalked it up to the kind of dash glitch an older truck throws when the air is damp and the alternator's working too hard. He told himself not to make patterns where there weren't any. He drove. Mile markers on Ashfield are small aluminum stakes sunk into the grass where the shoulder would be, if there was a shoulder. The numbers are hand stenciled. They don't look like the county put them there. At mile 9, the stencil is straight. At mile 10, it tips. At mile 11, the paint runs like a nosebleed. At mile 12, the 2 looks like it tried to run and got caught. Evan has known these markers his whole life. His grandfather taught him to count them before he could count quarters. But that night, the stakes were wrong. There were more. Twice as many. Maybe. Small gleams of reflectivity winking in the weeds every couple 100 feet, each one stamped with a 13. 13. 13. 13. As if the road was practicing writing its favorite number over and over until it got it perfect. Evan slowed. He told himself there had been a prank kids with stencils. He told himself a lot of things. His radio, unasked, clicked 1 notch louder. A man's voice threaded through static and said the same word twice in a tone that was almost human. Turn around. Turn around. He knew the folklore. Everyone does. Mile 13 allegedly loops. If you hit it just wrong time, wrong weather, wrong heartbeat, you'll drive and somehow keep arriving at the same place. A circle the road draws around you, tightening each time. Some people say it's a trick of the brain. Others say it's the calamity nearby. There was a church out here once, they say, embers still in the ash on a winter morning. There was a school bus that took the curve too fast. There were men who didn't come home from work, and their wives learned to stop asking where the ash on their boots came from. You don't have to pick a reason to feel a place is wrong. Sometimes the place picks you. The curve that follows the false milestones leans hard left, then launches you onto a straightaway that looks infinite. Evan settled into it and watched the center line stitch out in front of him. The fog coalesced into low shapes that ran ahead of the bumper and then broke apart. He checked his mirrors. Behind him, the red eyes of his taillights painted the leaves in two ragged bars. Between those bars, something moved 4 feet, too long in the spine. The kind of movement that reads as animal until your body decides, without consulting you, that it isn't. He kept his hands steady. Up ahead, a glow showed like a coal under wet paper. A car sat nose down in the ditch, hazard lights chewing the fog. Beside it, a figure raised an arm. Evan is the kind of man who stops. He didn't like that about himself right then. He wanted to keep rolling. He wanted to say, "Not my problem." But his foot was already on the brake, his hand already finding the switch that throws his own hazards. He pulled to a crawl, angled the truck to light the scene, and rolled the window down an inch. "You okay?" he called. The figure didn't answer, just stood there in the ditch, hands still up, like a student who's already forgotten the question they raised their hand for. The hazard lights pulsed, and, for one beat, the ditch was empty. For the next, it held a shape that was human in height but wrong in the way it met the weeds, like it was standing on the idea of ground and not the ground itself. Evan eased forward, heart chattering. "I'll call it in," he said, half to the ditch, half to the night. He reached for his phone. No bars, and yet the screen showed one notification. A new voicemail from an unknown number time-stamped 1:47 a.m. The minute his dash had tried to repeat, he pressed play. A long hallway of sound opened in his ear. Footsteps, water on stone. Then a small voice, a child's, soft and careful like kids get when they repeat something an adult told them. "Don't stop for the first one," the voice said. "The first one is not real." Evan stared at the ditch. The figure's arms sagged. The hazards kept chewing. "I'm coming back," he lied, and eased off the brake. And the truck rolled, and the straightaway rolled with him, and the fog kept its slow knitting motion, and the curve lifted, and somewhere between that ditch and the next corner, his odometer slid to 7.1, then 7, then 6.9. Like someone was unspooling the road behind him and winding it up on a dark hand. He passed the iron bridge again. No, he passed an iron bridge. This one wore the same rust, the same narrow, the same draft of cold air, where the creek breathes up. But the graffiti on the truss had moved. A name that wasn't there before was there now. Under it, 3 notches like tally marks, and a 4th notch, half scratched, as if made by someone who got distracted midway. "Honk 3 times and you'll get 4. Evan didn't touch the horn. He let the truck roll and kept his eyes forward and tried not to think about who or what makes a tally and stops at 3.5. You can break a loop, they say, by doing something the road doesn't expect. Some folks toss a token out the window, a ring, a key, a scrap of something that mattered to them once. Some whisper an apology to whatever owned the place before the asphalt did. A few people say you have to give the road exactly what it gave you. If it took time, give it time. If it gave you a voice, speak. If it showed you a hand, show it yours. Evan had nothing he was willing to throw away. He had something else, though a habit. In his turnout bag was a small orange triangle flare he kept, even when the station told everybody to switch to LED beacons. Old school. Messy. Bright enough to stain the night red. He eased the truck onto the narrowest sliver of gravel he could find, killed the engine so the silence hit all at once, and stepped out into a world that felt like it had been waiting for the sound of his boots on wet stone. The air smelled like cold iron and wet leaves. The creek talked to itself somewhere down the embankment. He cracked the flare, and it woke with a hiss, light pouring out of it like blood out of a cut. He set it at the lip of the bridge, and then, heart-thumping, he did something the road did not expect. He stepped back from the edge. He didn't lean. He didn't look for anything in the water that might be looking back. He just stood, hands open, and said, because there was nothing else to say, "I'm not here to take." I'm here to pass. For a long second, nothing moved. Then the flare's smoke blew in one direction, as if a breath had decided to leave. On the skin of the creek, the red light unstitched into ripples. And where the ripples overlapped, words formed 3 letters, then the hint of a 4th, the same half mark he'd seen scratched on the truss. The water seemed to make the shape reluctantly, then let it collapse. Behind him, on the far end of the bridge, hazard lights blinked once. Not a car, just the lights, floating, synced to the flare's hiss. Evan swallowed. Not stopping for the first one, he said gently into the red. And the lights blinked again in what his body, traitorously, recognized as approval. He got back in the truck. He didn't look at the odometer. He didn't look at the clock. He just drove. The false mile 13 stakes thinned, went missing, then returned as actual numbers that climbed the way numbers should. 11. 12. A right-hand bend that opened like a curtain. And finally, a green sign that said, with the brutal blandness of bureaucracy, State Route 17 left lane. He felt his shoulders drop for the first time in an hour, and because habits don't let go, gently checked his rear view. There, painted wetly across the bottom edge of his tailgate in a narrow, kid-height streak, was a finger drawn in road dust, not a word. Not a tally, just a single clean line trailing off to the right, as if someone had walked their hand along the truck and let go at exactly the moment the loop did. He didn't sleep right for a week, kept waking at 1:47, then lying there until 1:48 ticked over properly, because he needed to see it pass. When he finally went back to Ashfield in daylight, the bridge looked like nothing. The creek was just a creek. The truss wore its rust. The tally on the steel had become 4 clean cuts. The extra mile 13 stakes were gone, if they'd ever been there. The flare burn still scarred the concrete black thumbprint of fireproof that something had happened, even if he couldn't sell anyone on the details. People will tell you roads don't remember. That's true most places. Asphalt doesn't care. It's a moving thing, settling and cracking and letting weeds through where they can. But some stretches do more than move cars. They take measure. They return what's owed. And if you get caught in the wrong 10 miles at the wrong hour, they make you decide which kind of person you are when there's no one around to applaud you for it. So, if you ever find yourself in the Blue Ridge foothills after midnight, fog pooling in the hollows like breath, and your radio, dead for miles, clicks just once and says an ordinary word twice, and the mile marker ahead of you says what the last one said. Keep your hands steady. Don't honk first. Don't stop for the first one. And if the road seems to want something, give it light, not blood. Because some places don't want you to leave an offering. They just want to know you remember how to pass through without taking anything that isn't yours.
Deep in the hills of West Virginia stands a massive Gothic structure, its towers piercing the sky like fingers reaching from a forgotten grave. This is Weston State Hospital, once known as the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, a place where thousands entered seeking healing but found only darkness, suffering, and for many, death itself. Built with noble intentions, this fortress of stone would become home to unspeakable horrors, illegal experiments, and tortured souls whose cries still echo through its abandoned halls. Tonight, we journey into one of America's most haunted locations, where the line between treatment and torture blurred beyond recognition, and where the spirits of the forgotten refuse to rest. This is a story of madness, mystery, and the dark side of medicine that will chill you to your very core. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments. In the mid-1800s, the United States faced a growing crisis. Mental illness was poorly understood, and those suffering from psychological ailments were often locked away in prisons, poorhouses, or simply left to wander the streets. The treatment of the mentally ill was barbaric, inhumane, and desperately in need of reform. It was during this era of awakening that a revolutionary idea took hold, that the mentally ill deserved compassionate care in facilities designed specifically for their treatment and recovery. This is where our story truly begins. In the year 1858, when the Virginia General Assembly authorized the construction of what would become one of the largest hand-cut stone buildings in North America. The location chosen was Weston, a small town in what would later become West Virginia, nestled in the Appalachian foothills. The site was selected with great care, positioned along the West Fork River, surrounded by fertile farmland and blessed with natural beauty that physicians believed would aid in patient recovery. The design of this massive undertaking was entrusted to Richard Snowden Andrews, a Baltimore architect who embraced the Kirkbride Plan, a revolutionary approach to asylum design developed by Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride. This plan emphasized the therapeutic benefits of architecture itself, promoting natural light, proper ventilation, and a layout that would facilitate patient care while maintaining dignity and hope for recovery. The building was designed in the Gothic and Tudor Revival styles, with massive stone walls, towering spires, and an imposing presence that spoke of permanence and authority. Construction began in 1858, but the project would prove far more challenging than anyone anticipated. The American Civil War erupted in 1861, bringing construction to a grinding halt. West Virginia separated from Virginia in 1863, becoming its own state, and the partially completed asylum stood silent and empty, a stone skeleton waiting for life to fill its halls. Workers were scarce, funds were limited, and the nation was too busy tearing itself apart to worry about the mentally ill. It wasn't until 1864 that construction resumed in earnest, and even then, progress was agonizingly slow. The building required massive quantities of hand-cut stone, each block carefully shaped and fitted by skilled stonemasons. Bricks were fired on site, timber was harvested from surrounding forests, and every nail, every window, every door had to be crafted with meticulous attention to detail. The labor was backbreaking, the conditions harsh, and the vision seemed almost impossibly grand. Finally, after nearly a decade of construction, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum officially opened its doors in 1864, though the building was far from complete. The first patients arrived to find a structure that was only partially finished, with construction continuing around them for years to come. The asylum wouldn't be fully completed until 1881, a full 23 years after construction began. The completed facility was absolutely massive, stretching over 920 feet in length, making it one of the longest buildings in the United States at the time. It featured 242 rooms spread across 4 floors, with additional space in the towers and basement levels. The central administration building rose proudly in the middle, flanked by 2 enormous wings that extended outward like embracing arms. Each wing was further divided into sections, with male patients housed on one side and female patients on the other, separated to maintain Victorian standards of propriety. The asylum was originally designed to house 250 patients comfortably, with each person having their own room, access to fresh air and sunlight, and space to walk and exercise. The Kirkbride Plan emphasized the healing power of environment, and the facility included beautiful grounds with gardens, walking paths, and areas where patients could engage in therapeutic agricultural work. There was a working farm, a dairy, a greenhouse, and workshops where patients could learn trades and contribute to the asylum's self-sufficiency. The early years of the asylum's operation reflected these noble intentions. Patients were treated with relative humanity, given productive tasks to occupy their minds, and encouraged to participate in their own recovery. The medical superintendent and staff genuinely believed in the therapeutic mission of the institution. Treatment focused on fresh air, good nutrition, regular sleep, meaningful work, and minimal use of restraints or medications, which were primitive at best during this era. But the story of Weston State Hospital, like so many asylums of its time, is not one of sustained hope and healing. It is a story of how good intentions crumbled under the weight of overcrowding, underfunding, and the dark evolution of psychiatric treatment in America. The problems began gradually, but accelerated rapidly. By the early 1900s, the asylum that was designed for 250 patients was housing well over 400. The reasons for this overcrowding were numerous and complex. As awareness of the asylum spread, more and more people were committed to its care. But the definition of who belonged in an asylum expanded dramatically during this period. People weren't just committed for genuine mental illness. They were locked away for alcoholism, epilepsy, rebellious behavior, physical disabilities,
and sometimes simply for being different or inconvenient to their families. Women were particularly vulnerable to wrongful commitment. A woman who spoke too freely, who refused to marry, who challenged male authority, or who simply made her husband or father uncomfortable could find herself declared insane and locked away indefinitely. The commitment process was shockingly informal, often requiring little more than the signature of a family member and a compliant physician. Once inside the asylum walls, proving one's sanity became nearly impossible. By the 1920s, Weston State Hospital was in crisis. The patient population had swelled to over 700, nearly 3 times its designed capacity. Patients who once had private rooms now slept in hallways, storage rooms, and repurposed spaces never intended for human habitation. The beautiful grounds and therapeutic programs that characterized the early years deteriorated as staff struggled simply to maintain basic order and safety. The overcrowding brought with it a cascade of problems that would transform the asylum into a house of horrors. Sanitation became a serious issue, with inadequate plumbing and waste disposal systems overwhelmed by far more people than they were designed to serve. Patients often went unbathed for weeks, their clothes unchanged, their bedding filthy. The stench within certain wards became overwhelming, a nauseating combination of human waste, unwashed bodies, and the underlying smell of decay that seemed to permeate the very stones of the building. Violence increased dramatically as desperate, confused, and mentally ill patients were crammed together with insufficient supervision. Patients attacked each other, attacked staff, and inflicted terrible injuries upon themselves. The few attendants available were often untrained, underpaid, and overwhelmed by the sheer number of people under their care. Some staff members were compassionate and did their best under impossible circumstances. Others were cruel, taking out their frustrations on helpless patients through beatings, neglect, and psychological torment. The treatment methods employed at Weston during the 1920s through 1950s represent some of the darkest chapters in American medical history. As overcrowding worsened and the philosophy of psychiatric care shifted toward more aggressive interventions, patients at Weston were subjected to treatments that we would recognize today as torture. Hydrotherapy was widely used, but not in any therapeutic sense we might imagine today. Patients were subjected to ice-cold baths for hours at a time, their bodies submerged until they became hypothermic, their minds dulled by the shock. The theory was that this would calm agitated patients, but in reality, it was often punishment disguised as treatment. Some patients were wrapped in wet sheets and left for days, unable to move, developing bed sores and infections, slowly losing their grip on whatever sanity they had left. Electroshock therapy, introduced in the 1930s, was applied at Weston with frightening frequency and often without proper anesthesia. Patients were strapped to tables, electrodes attached to their temples, and powerful electrical currents sent coursing through their brains. The seizures this induced were violent and terrifying, causing broken bones, bitten tongues, and memory loss. Some patients received electroshock therapy dozens of times. Their personalities forever altered, their memories erased, reduced to docile shells of their former selves. But perhaps the most horrifying treatment employed at Weston was the lobotomy. This procedure, which involved severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex, was performed on patients at Weston during the 1940s and early 1950s. The procedure was often done with an ice pick-like instrument inserted through the eye socket, scrambling portions of the brain with crude precision. The results were devastating. Patients emerged from lobotomies as dramatically different people, often losing their ability to feel emotion, to plan, to create, to be fully human. Many were left in vegetative states, alive but not truly living, wandering the halls of Weston like ghosts until their bodies finally gave out. What makes the story of Weston even more tragic is that many of the people subjected to these horrific treatments shouldn't have been in an asylum at all. The hospital records, which have been partially preserved, reveal commitment papers for people whose only illness was poverty, old age, or social nonconformity. There were women committed for reading too many novels, men locked away for political excitement, and countless individuals institutionalized simply because their families found them burdensome. By the 1950s, Weston State Hospital had become one of the most overcrowded psychiatric facilities in the United States. The patient population peaked at over 2,400 people. nearly 10 times the facility's designed capacity. The conditions were absolutely nightmarish. Patients slept on floors, in bathtubs, in closets, anywhere space could be found. The more violent or difficult patients were locked in cages, literally iron cages, where they were kept like animals, visible to anyone who walked past. The basement levels of Weston, never intended for patient housing, were converted into makeshift wards for the most severely ill and violent patients. These underground spaces were dark, damp, and cold, with stone walls that wept moisture and floors that never fully dried. The people locked down there, isolated from sunlight and fresh air, deteriorated rapidly. Many died in those basement cells, their bodies sometimes not discovered for days. Death was a constant presence at Weston State Hospital. Hundreds, possibly thousands of patients died within its walls over the decades of its operation. Some died from their illnesses, others from the treatments meant to cure them, and still others from neglect, abuse, and the sheer horror of their confinement. The hospital maintained its own cemetery, a field behind the main building where patients were buried in unmarked graves, their identities reduced to numbers carved on simple stones or sometimes not marked at all. The cemetery tells its own tragic story. Many of the people buried there had been abandoned by their families, forgotten by society, their only memorial, a patch of ground in West Virginia soil. Some graves contained multiple bodies, buried one atop another as space ran out. Others held the remains of infants and children, young lives extinguished before they had barely begun, committed to the asylum for ailments that today would be easily treatable or simply accepted as part of human diversity. Among the documented horrors of Weston are several cases that stand out for their particular cruelty. There was Lily, a patient in the 1920s who was locked in a solitary cell for weeks after attacking a nurse. She was found dead, her body emaciated, evidence suggesting she had been forgotten and left to starve. There was a man in the 1940s who hanged himself in his room after enduring repeated lobotomies that left him unable to recognize his own family. There were children diagnosed with developmental disabilities or simply rebellious behavior who grew to adulthood within Weston's walls, never knowing life outside the asylum. The staff who worked at Weston during its darkest years carry their own stories, many of which have emerged only in recent decades as former employees have spoken about their experiences. Some describe the overwhelming despair of working in conditions where providing genuine care was impossible, where they were forced to make terrible choices about who would receive the limited resources available. Others speak of colleagues who took advantage of vulnerable patients, of abuse that was overlooked or actively covered up, of a system that valued order and control over human dignity and healing. But there were also moments of unexpected kindness and humanity within Weston's walls. There are stories of nurses who spent their own money to buy patients, small luxuries of attendants who stayed late to comfort someone in distress, of doctors who fought against the system to protect their patients from the most harmful treatments. These acts of compassion, small lights in overwhelming darkness, remind us that even in the worst circumstances, human kindness can persist. By the 1960s, attitudes towards psychiatric care were beginning to shift dramatically in America. The development of new medications, particularly antipsychotics, offered the promise of treating mental illness without permanent institutionalization. The civil rights movement brought increased scrutiny to the treatment of institutionalized populations. Journalists began investigating conditions at state mental hospitals, and what they found was shocking enough to galvanize public opinion toward reform. A series of exposés in the 1970s revealed the appalling conditions at Weston and similar institutions across the country. Photographs showed patients living in filth, chained to radiators, locked in isolation cells barely large enough to lie down in. The American public was horrified to learn what had been done in their name, with their tax dollars, to people whose only crime was being different or ill. The deinstitutionalization movement gained momentum, driven by a combination of genuine humanitarian concern and economic pressures. Large state hospitals were expensive to operate, and the promise of community-based care seemed both more humane and more cost-effective. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Weston's patient population declined as people were released to community programs, nursing homes, or back to families who had long since moved on with their lives. But deinstitutionalization brought its own tragedies. Many former patients, released without adequate community support or follow-up care, ended up homeless, in prison, or simply lost in a society unprepared to support them. The closure of large institutions like Weston didn't solve the problem of mental illness in America. It simply moved it from one setting to another, often from bad conditions to worse ones. Weston State Hospital limped along through the 1980s and 90s with a steadily declining population. The massive building, designed for hundreds and once crammed with thousands, became increasingly empty. Whole wings were closed off, left to deteriorate as maintenance budgets dwindled. The physical plant, never fully modernized, became increasingly obsolete. Plumbing failed, heating systems broke down, and the grand old building began to crumble. Finally, in 1994, Weston State Hospital officially closed its doors. The last patients were transferred to a new, smaller facility nearby, and the massive Gothic structure was abandoned. For years, it sat empty, slowly decaying, its windows broken, its roof leaking, its walls covered in graffiti and vandalism. Nature began reclaiming the building, with vines creeping through broken windows and trees sprouting from cracked masonry. The abandoned hospital became a magnet for urban explorers, vandals, and those fascinated by the dark history of the place. People snuck into the deteriorating building, wandering halls where thousands had suffered and died, photographing the decay and collecting artifacts left behind. They found patient records scattered on floors, medical equipment rusting in forgotten rooms, and disturbing reminders of the building's past, including restraints still attached to walls and evidence of the various torturous treatments administered there. But it was the ghost stories that really captured public imagination and ultimately saved the building from complete destruction. Almost from the moment Weston closed, reports of paranormal activity began to emerge. Urban explorers reported hearing voices, screams, and the sound of footsteps in empty corridors. Photographs showed strange mists, shadow figures, and unexplained lights. People reported feelings of overwhelming sadness, of being watched, of invisible hands touching them in the darkness. The stories multiplied and became more specific. There were reports of a ghost known as Big Jim, supposedly the spirit of a patient who died in the hospital and now roams the halls. People claimed to encounter the spirit of a Civil War soldier, a reminder of the building's construction during that tumultuous period. The fourth floor, which housed the most violent and disturbed patients, became known for particularly intense paranormal activity, with reports of shadowing figures, disembodied voices, and an oppressive atmosphere that left visitors feeling terrified and ill. In the early 2000s, a group of investors purchased the deteriorating building with plans to stabilize and restore it. They opened portions of the facility for historical and paranormal tours, allowing the public to explore this dark chapter of American history. The tours became enormously popular, drawing people from across the country and around the world who wanted to walk the halls where so much suffering had occurred. The paranormal tours at Weston, now officially known as the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, have documented thousands of alleged supernatural encounters. Tour guides report routine paranormal activity, including objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut, and electronic equipment malfunctioning in specific locations. Visitors frequently report being touched, pushed, or grabbed by unseen forces. Some have fled the building in terror, unable to complete their tours. The medical wing, where many of the most invasive treatments were performed, is considered particularly active. People report hearing the sounds of surgery, moaning and crying, and the distinctive buzz of electroshock equipment, though no power has run through these rooms in decades. The isolation cells in the basement, where violent patients were locked away, produce feelings of panic and claustrophobia so intense that many visitors refuse to enter. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports involving children. Weston housed a number of children over the years, and there are specific reports of child spirits still present in the building. Tour guides speak of a little girl named Lily, who supposedly died at the hospital and now plays in the halls, her laughter heard echoing through empty rooms. Some visitors report feeling small hands tugging at their clothing or seeing the shadow of a child darting around corners. Paranormal investigators have flocked to Weston, conducting elaborate investigations using thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, voice recorders, and other equipment designed to detect supernatural activity. Many claim to have captured compelling evidence of ghosts, including voices responding to questions, figures appearing on camera, and dramatic fluctuations in electromagnetic fields that can't be explained by natural causes. Skeptics, of course, argue that the paranormal reports can be explained by psychology, suggestion, and the power of expectation. Walking through a dark, deteriorating building with a history of suffering, knowing the terrible things that happen there, would naturally make people anxious and hyper-aware of any unusual sensations. Old buildings make strange sounds as they settle and decay. Shadows and light can play tricks on the eyes. The human brain, primed to find patterns and meaning, can interpret random sensations as evidence of the supernatural. But believe
If you are listening to this late at night, perhaps with the lights dimmed and the windows dark, then you already understand the particular kind of quiet that precedes something wrong. It is not the absence of sound. Exactly. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to ask you something. Where are you right now? And what time is it where you're watching this? Are you alone in your room, with the lights off? Or just a little dim? Is it late enough that the world outside has gone quiet? Take a moment, look around you, because stories like this feel different depending on where you are. And one more thing, I'd really like to know what kind of stories you want to hear next. So if there's something you've been thinking about, something dark, strange, or unsettling, leave your idea. I might turn it into the next story you hear. Now, let's begin. It is more like sound pulling back, retreating, as if the world itself is holding its breath before something is allowed to happen. This is a story about that kind of quiet. It is a story about a stretch of road along the Kanawha River Valley in the state of West Virginia, about summer heat that sits heavy on the asphalt long after the sun has gone down, and about 3 people who stopped for ordinary reasons at ordinary places and did not survive the night. It is also a story about the years that followed, about a witness who knew something and could not make anyone listen, about a community that moved on because moving on is the only thing communities know how to do, and about what it means when the darkness outside a gas station window is not simply darkness. The Kanawha Valley sits in the western part of West Virginia, carved out over millennia by the river that bears its name. Charleston, the state capital, rests at the valley's center, surrounded by smaller communities that line the water and the roads that follow it. The towns have names that sound almost biblical in their plainness: South Charleston, Campbell's Creek, St. Albans, each one connected to the next by a 2-lane highway or a state route that cuts through hills thick with second-growth forest. In the summer of 2003, those roads were lit by nothing more than the occasional gas station sign, the amber glow of a Go-Mart convenience store, or the white fluorescent pulse of a Speedway filling station. Most of the area's residents had driven these roads so many times they no longer thought about them. They were simply the paths between one part of life and another. You drove them at night without thinking, because you had always driven them at night, because nothing had ever happened. That was the nature of the place. Not dangerous, not threatening, just a valley in the middle of America where people lived ordinary lives in the spaces between the hills. Gary Carrier Jr. was 44 years old and lived in South Charleston. By all accounts, he was a man of routine. He worked, he kept to himself mostly, and on the night of August 10th, 2003, he stopped at a Go-Mart on the main road through Charleston because he needed to use the payphone outside. State records indicate that the call was made sometime after dark. The parking lot would have been partially lit, the kind of orange-yellow light that convenience store exteriors cast in a wide, uneven circle, leaving the edges of the lot in shadow. A payphone in 2003 was still a common sight. You picked it up, you dialed, you talked. Carrier was doing exactly that. He was talking on the phone, and then he was not. The shot struck him in the head. He died at the scene. No one who was present in that lot at that moment had seen where it came from. They had heard the sound, which investigators later noted had been initially mistaken for something mechanical, a car backfiring perhaps. The way sounds at night are often misidentified because the brain does not want to assign them their proper meaning. The bullet was small caliber. It had come from a distance. Beyond that, the investigation had very little to work with in those first hours. Dispatch logs show that officers arrived within minutes, but by then there was nothing to find except what had already been lost. 4 days passed. The valley breathed its hot summer air. People locked their doors a little more carefully, but not much more. There had been no pattern yet. One terrible thing can still be an accident of the universe, a singular and senseless event with no logic binding it to anything. It is only with the second event that a pattern begins to take shape. And it is in that moment of recognition, the moment when 2 points on a map connect into a line, that fear changes its quality. It becomes something wider, something harder to contain. Jeannie Patton was 31 years old and lived in Campbell's Creek, a small community that follows the creek of the same name as it winds back from the main river valley into the hills. On the night of August 14th, 2003, she stopped at a Speedway filling station sometime around 10:30 in the evening. The station was the kind of place that punctuates those valley roads at regular intervals. Pumps under a flat canopy, a small lit interior, the hiss and click of a fuel nozzle. She had pumped her gas. She had turned and was walking toward the station entrance to pay. The bullet struck her in the back of the head. She died there, between the pumps and the door, on a night that had been, until that moment, entirely unremarkable. Investigators would note later that the shot had come from some elevation and at a significant distance, consistent with a shooter positioned in the hills or the tree line that bordered the station. The small caliber round, later determined to have been fired from a .22 Magnum Marlin rifle, left a wound consistent with the weapon used 4 days earlier in Charleston. Whether the same rifle had been used in both cases could not be confirmed with certainty, because the first bullet had been too damaged by impact to yield a complete ballistic match. Archived notes from the investigation suggest that investigators believed the same weapon was likely responsible, but the qualification was important. Likely is not certainly. Likely is the kind of word that haunts a case file for years. 90 minutes after Jeannie Patton was killed at the Speedway, a man named Okie Meadows Jr., 26 years old, and also a resident of Campbell's Creek, stopped at the Go-Mart on United States Route 60, approximately 10 miles from the Speedway. He was purchasing milk. He was standing at a security window, the kind of transaction window that some late-night convenience stores use so that cashiers do not have to be directly exposed to whoever comes to the door after dark. A protection, in theory. The bullet struck him in the neck. He died there, at the window, on the same night, in the same valley, 90 minutes after his neighbor. 3 people in 4 days. The same weapon, or one identical to it. The same method. A single shot from a distance, at night, at people doing the smallest, most ordinary things a person can do. Using a phone, buying gas, picking up milk. The investigation that followed was extensive. Law enforcement from multiple agencies participated. A joint task force was eventually assembled. Police said at the time that they were looking for a dark-colored full-size pickup truck seen in the vicinity of at least 2 of the shooting locations. Eyewitnesses described a large white male behind the wheel, though the darkness of the nights in question made further identification impossible. Archived notes suggest that a person matching this profile was eventually located and questioned, a man who had allegedly implied to people in his social circle that he was the shooter. No charges related to the shootings were ever brought against him. His name does not appear in any public record associated with the case. What investigators never confirmed publicly was the degree to which the shootings may have been targeted rather than random. The prevailing early theory, the one that was offered to the public and to the press, was that a sniper had selected victims arbitrarily, perhaps choosing them for the simple, terrible reason that they were alone, visible, and still. This was the theory that made the most intuitive sense to people who did not know these roads or these communities. It was the theory that allowed the shootings to feel, if not explicable, at least contained within a familiar framework. The D.C. sniper attacks of October 2002 had taken place less than a year earlier, and the comparison was immediate and obvious. 2 shooters in a modified vehicle operating across a wide geography, creating panic by the apparent randomness of their selections. The West Virginia case fit that template neatly enough that it became the lens through which the public understood it. But there was a man in Campbell's Creek who knew something different. His name was not made public. He had lived in the area most of his life, and in the summer of 2003, he carried information that he could not put down and could not give away. His younger brother had, at some point before the shootings, stolen something valuable from a man named Sean Lester. Not money, not drugs directly, though drugs were part of it, an automobile engine. An engine in which a large quantity of methamphetamine had been hidden. His brother had taken that engine, and in doing so had taken whatever Lester valued most about it, which was not the engine. Lester had found out. And Lester had said something to the witness that lodged itself in his memory like a splinter beneath the skin. He had said that since the brother had taken something important to him, he would take something important to the brother. He had told the witness to keep an eye on the news. Jeannie Patton was the longtime girlfriend of the witness's younger brother. The witness had gone to the Kanawha County Sheriff's Department. He had told them what he knew. He had submitted to a polygraph examination and passed it. Investigators never confirmed whether his account was acted upon in those early months. What is documented is that no arrest was made. The investigation continued. The task force continued. The reward for information leading to the killer was set at $50,000 and would later be increased to $100,000. The dark pickup truck remained unidentified. The rifle was never recovered. The witness continued to live in the valley, in the community where Jeannie Patton had also lived, carrying what he knew. There is a detail from this period that does not appear in any official record, but is consistent with what several residents of Campbell's Creek described in subsequent years. In the weeks following the shootings, a certain quality settled over the community that went beyond ordinary grief or ordinary fear. People described it differently depending on who you spoke to, but the descriptions converged on something similar: a reluctance to be outside at night, a habit of checking the tree line before walking to a car. An awareness of distance, of the unseen reaches beyond a parking lot or a gas station canopy. The hills that border those valley roads had always been simply hills. After August of 2003, they became something else. They became vantage points. They became the places from which something could watch without being seen. Several months before the three connected shootings, a man named Randy Burgess had been shot twice in the chest in the parking lot of a local Kroger supermarket. The shooting was sniper-style in its execution. He died the following day. Investigators at the time noted that no hard evidence connected Burgess's death to the Go-Martin Speedway shootings that would follow, but they also noted that the possibility could not be dismissed. The geometry of it was uncomfortable. The same general region, the same general method, a period of approximately 5 months between the Burgess shooting and the first of the 3 summer killings. Whether Burgess was a practice run, a coincidence, or something else entirely remained one of those questions that the investigation simply could not answer. State records indicate that the Burgess case was reviewed by the Joint Task Force, but was ultimately treated as a separate matter. In October of 2003, as the autumn moved into the valley and the leaves came down from the hills, the task force made its public announcement of the reward increase. A spokesperson said that investigators were following every lead. The word "every" has a particular weight in a press conference statement. It is meant to be reassuring, but it functions instead as a kind of admission, an acknowledgement that the leads that have been followed so far have not been sufficient. By October of 2003, more than 2 months had passed since Oakey Meadows had been shot at the security window on Route 60, and no one had been arrested. The witness waited. He had passed his polygraph. He had named a name. He continued to live in the valley. 3 years passed. 4 years. The Joint Task Force eventually disbanded, as task forces do when a case cannot be resolved in the near term. The reward remained technically available, but rewards that go uncollected for years take on a different character. They become part of the background of a community. A reminder that sits on a shelf, accumulating dust. Dispatch logs from those years show no significant developments in the case. The investigation was not closed, officially. It was simply still. In January of 2007, a local public access television program called West Virginia's Most Wanted aired a segment on the shootings. The show's host, a man named Andrew Palmer, presented a theory that had been circulating in some form among people who had followed the case closely. He proposed that a small local gang, referred to in the segment as the Charleston Five, had carried out the 3 shootings in a coordinated fashion. His theory suggested that Jeannie Patton had been the intended target from the beginning, and that Gary Carrier Jr. and Okie Meadows Jr. had been killed not randomly but strategically, as a way of obscuring the motive and diffusing the investigation's focus. 2 arbitrary victims to conceal one purposeful one. The witness, appearing anonymously on the program, described what he had been told by Lester in the period before the killings. The segment aired to a limited audience, as public access programming does. There is no record of it prompting any formal investigative response at the time. 4 more years passed. The valley continued its slow particular life. People who had been alive on the night of August 14, 2003, grew older. The filling station where Jeannie Patton had died continued to serve drivers on that road. The Go-Mart on Route 60, where Okie Meadows had stood at a security window with a carton of milk, continued to operate. The payphone outside the Charleston Go-Mart, where Gary Carrier had been on the phone, was eventually removed, as payphones were removed from every corner of every American city in the years after cell service made them obsolete. The infrastructure of those 3 ordinary moments was slowly dismantled and replaced, as infrastructure always is. On March 31, 2011, Sean Lester was arrested and charged with the murder of Jeannie Patton. He was 45 years old at the time of his arrest. He had been a free man for nearly 8 years following the killings. Investigators executed a search of property belonging to a woman believed to have sheltered Lester and his associates in the period following the shootings. The property was excavated. They were looking for the dark-colored pickup truck that had been seen near at least 2 of the shooting locations. They were also, according to accounts from that period, looking for evidence of other victims, people whose names had not yet appeared in any case file. Investigators never confirmed what, if anything, was found during that excavation. In August of 2011, Lester was indicted for all 3 murders. A year later, at the outset of his trial, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Jeannie Patton. The charges relating to Gary Carrier Jr. and Okie Meadows Jr. were dropped as part of the plea agreement. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. A subsequent federal proceeding resulted in a consecutive 6-year sentence on firearms possession charges. 40 years, 6 years, numbers that settle the legal accounting of what happened in the Kanawha Valley in the summer of 2003. But accounting is not the same as understanding. A plea agreement to second-degree murder means that the question of premeditation was formally set aside. It means that what Lester said to the witness, the statement about taking something important in return for something important, was never tested before a jury. The theory of the Charleston Five was never confirmed or denied in open court. The other 2 murders were dropped, which is a legal term for something that does not feel like dropping at all when you consider that Gary Carrier Jr. was using a payphone and Okie Meadows Jr. was buying milk. There is a particular kind of unfinished quality to a case like this one. It is not the unfinished quality of a mystery without a solution. A man was arrested. A man pleaded guilty. A sentence was handed down. In the formal language of the law, the matter is resolved. But resolution in a legal sense and resolution in a human sense are not the same thing. The witness, who had sat with this knowledge for the better part of a decade, who had passed a polygraph and been ignored, who had appeared anonymously on a public access program and waited 4 more years before an arrest was made, was never publicly identified. His name is not in the record. What he did with what he knew, in all those years of knowing it, is not recorded anywhere. The hills are still there, above those roads. The gas stations are still there, lit up at night in that familiar orange-yellow glow. Drivers still stop in the small hours because they need fuel or milk, or because they need to make a call, and the parking lots are still the same incomplete circles of light, and beyond the light there is still the dark, and in the dark there are the hills, and the hills are quiet the way that the valley has always been quiet, which is the kind of quiet that has no explanation. The kind that you notice only after you have already pulled off the road and stepped out of your car. And by then you are standing in the light, and the light only reaches so far, and past it there is everything else, still and watching, the way it has always been. What happened in those hills in August of 2003 was documented. It was investigated. It was, in the end, adjudicated. But the ground that was excavated in 2011, looking for a truck and for whatever else might be buried there, the results of that excavation remain, as far as any public record shows, unconfirmed. The property belongs to someone. The hills belong to everyone and no one. The roads run the same way they always have, between one lit place and the next, through the dark in between. Somewhere in the valley, the distance between 2 points is still exactly what it was, and the men and women who drive those roads at night, who stop because they are thirsty or tired, or because they simply need a moment's rest, they do not think about it. They pull in under the canopy lights, and they get out of their cars, and they walk toward the glass door, and for a moment, just a moment, they are standing perfectly still in a circle of light. And all around them, the night is the way it always is out here, wide and dark and very, very quiet.